When we do that, suddenly everyone who is Zooming at home will see this room. We have our cameraman and our audio man at the back, and they are filming your backs and the panel's lovely faces. And if you get up to ask a question later over there, please turn around so that you're facing the camera and they can hear you and see you. So in a couple of minutes, I'll ask everyone to just kind of keep it to a dull roar for a minute. But that's okay. I mean, you can cough and good evening, and welcome to the first in-person gathering of Northumberland Learning Connection since November 2019. This is my second good evening. If you heard me when my mic wasn't supposed to be on a few minutes ago, we're all learning. So thank you for being patient. Can I ask everyone in the room tonight to turn your phones off or put it in airplane mode before we begin? Thanks. The first thing we will do is to respectfully acknowledge that we are located in the traditional and treaty territory of the Mississauga and Chippewa Nations, collectively known as the Williams Treaties First Nations, which include Curve Lake, Hiawatha, Alderville, Scugog Island, Rama, Beausoleil, and Georgina Island First Nations. We respectfully acknowledge that the Williams Treaty First Nations have been stewards and caretakers of these lands and waters, and that today remain vigilant over their health and integrity for generations to come. We are all treaty people. Now, a little housekeeping. As I said before, and I'll mention it again, we ask our in-person audience to remain seated with your masks on as much as possible. And to everyone, you will note that this event is a free one. We invite you, if you are able, to donate to a local climate change initiative. Tonight, we're just delighted to see so many faces here in person in Cobourg. And more than 100 others are joining us on Zoom. So that's about 200 people coming out to hear or staying in to hear about local actions for climate change. Please allow me a really short minute to recognize the unflagging efforts of the NLC Volunteer Board. That's right, we do this for fun over the past 18 months. We hope it looks easy, but the truth is many people have put in hundreds of hours to research and engage great speakers without meeting them beforehand, except for tonight, to navigate the surprising quirks of Zooming, and to keep NLC operations afloat. I would be remiss in not singling out Program Committee Chair Dorothy Gale and one of our newest board members, Marg Traylor, who joined NLC at the height of the pandemic and embraced the challenge of becoming a resident Zoom expert. Thank you all. Now, on to the program. Our moderator for Pathways to Net Zero Local Actions is Denny Manchi. Denny is a journalist with over 40 years of experience who makes Cobourg her home and environmentalism her passion. Our panelists from the far side, I'm not going to say left or right because who knows. We have Steve Lapp, who has designed, built, researched, and taught renewable energy systems, technology, and policy since 1982. Craig Ballard is the CEO of Elexicon Group, a company devoted to helping organizations significantly improve sustainability and reduce energy consumption in their facilities. And Judy Smith is a board member of Sustainable Cobourg and was the first environmental officer for Northumberland County. I'll now turn things over to Denny. Thank you.
Thanks, Betty, and hello. It feels like live TV. It's incredible. Hello to all of you out there in virtual land. It's great to see so many people in the same room, gathered in this room in particular. It's been so long, and it really, it's heartwarming. And especially to see members of the environmental community here. We have Blue Dot Northumberland represented, and Sustainable Cobourg, and Community Power Northumberland. Anyway, you'll have an opportunity to talk to these people after the official presentation, and I hope you do engage with them and find out more about what they're doing. I have to tell you that climate change has worked its way into my dreams. I had one a few nights ago about having to create a visual design concept for bidirectional charging of our EV. And I woke up sweating. So hopefully the panel can help fill in the gaps about that. Here's how the evening is going to work. Each of the speakers, starting with Steve Lapp, will have 5 minutes to talk. And then we'll start a Q&A session, and I will ask a few questions at the beginning, and then we'll invite questions from the audience here and at home, alternating back and forth. And if you'd like to ask a question here, we're going to ask you to step up to a mic that will be set up over there. So let's get started, and we're going to start with Steve Lapp.
Elizabeth, are we ready? We are. Okay. I feel 5 minutes is not a lot, so this is going to be sort of personal actions on climate change 101 in the shortest time I've ever done it. But there will be time for questions, and I think the purpose of tonight is to have lots of time for questions. So as I whiz through these sort of 7 slides, just park your question and we'll get to it. With the 3 of us, my role, and I'm supposed to stand on this X for Zoom, so I better remember to do that. Yeah. With the 3 of us, I'm going to address specifically personal choices you can make which lower your greenhouse gas emissions. Craig and Judy are going to talk about bigger things, and I feel very much like I'm following in the footsteps of giants from the last 2 talks where we looked at world finance and super big things. But my talk is specifically about what you can do, tomorrow or next week or in the next few months to reduce your emissions significantly. Okay, here we go, Elizabeth. That's it. We can keep going. One more. So we all know from the last couple talks, eliminating and going to zero on greenhouse gas emissions is the critical path we're all on. So I'm not going to talk any more about that. We're just going to go, how do we get there? Another click, please. So the tools that we have, sort of the toolbox that we have to get there are these things. Technologies and electric vehicles and heat pumps are 2 things I'm going to talk about tonight. But the other tools in the toolbox are levers, however you want to call them. Wind energy, biomass, geothermal. Craig's going to talk about that a little bit. Solar, hydrogen, smart grids, storage of energy is a big part of how we get there. Sequestration, nuclear, maybe. We don't know for sure exactly how that'll unfold in Ontario. And then policy and finance are the other big parts. I'm going to look at just the 2 top ones right now. Okay, another slide, please. So specifically the things that, day by day that we can make a difference with are our vehicles, our home heating, whether we travel and how we travel. And then food is also something that upstream, there's a lot happening when we buy our food and what kind of food we buy. I'm not going to talk a lot about that tonight. Really going to focus on the vehicles and the home heating because that's where the big numbers are. Okay, another one. So this is a little bit ugly, so you won't be able to read it all, but these are Ontario's emissions as a pie chart. And if you click ahead, one more, and then one more, these are the areas where electric vehicles would reduce emissions. So in Ontario, we produce about 159 million tons a year of greenhouse gas emissions. If we took all the passenger vehicles and electrified them, hopefully before 2050 or by 2050, we'd cut out nearly a quarter of our emissions, somewhere in that range. And then if we electrify our homes, instead of using natural gas and oil and propane, if we electrify our homes, we cut out about half of these building emissions. Okay, forward. And this is just a really quick survey of sort of the amount of emissions that come from our typical activities. So if you're driving a gasoline-powered car, 20,000 kilometers a year, small car, hybrid, 2 tons, bigger car, SUV, pickup, maybe 6 tons. Again, ahead, yep. Typical houses, the small wartime houses in Cobourg to larger homes, whether they're super efficient, a little less efficient, somewhere around 4 to 12 tons per year. Natural gas is less, oil is more. Again, if you travel somewhere like to Paris and back by plane, that's about 2 tons of emissions. It's a little argued, there's some complicated science there with contrails, and some of you probably read about that. It might be 4 tons, sort of argument going on about that again. Food is quite variable per person, depending if you're on a vegan diet to a heavy meat diet would be in the higher end of things. But it's sort of like the flying in terms of an annual thing per person, like a transatlantic trip. And again, overall, that would mean, for a typical person, again, it depends how many people live in the house and all that kind of stuff, but you're in the sort of 9 to 23 ton range. And in Ontario, it averages out to 11.3 tons per capita. That's all emissions. That includes our industry and everything else upstream. Okay. I think I got a minute left, maybe. Keep going. These are just sort of the emissions from heating homes in different ways. Got to stand on the X, I must know. Oil homes, depending on the size of the home, sort of 6 to 12 tons. Propane, a little bit less. Natural gas, a lot less. And that's why we often think of natural gas as being a clean fuel. But for home heating, it's still many tons of emissions per year. And again, Elizabeth. And these are sort of bigger vehicles to more efficient like vehicles, but all running on gasoline. So in the sort of 2 to 6, 7, 8 tons per year, driving 20,000 in the head. Yep, that's the flight to Paris. Keep going. One more. Actually, give us the other, and then one, and then one. That's good. Stop there. Thank you. So this is about the emissions from heating hot water for a home with natural gas, oil, or propane. And this is where it gets interesting. As soon as we go to electrification, because our grid in Ontario has so little fossil fuel as part of the generation anymore, mostly just natural gas. I'm sure Craig can correct me. Is there anything other than natural gas as fossil fuel in the grid?
Just a little bit, not in the grid.
Yeah, not in the grid. So as soon as we go to electrification, our emissions drop dramatically for our activities. So our electric hot water goes to well less than a ton. Our heat pump heated house also less than a ton, even a big house. And if you're driving an EV 20,000 kilometers a year, you're literally in the range of 100 kilograms to maybe 200 kilograms of carbon dioxide or equivalent a year. So 0.2 tons max, 0.1 ton for sort of typical small EVs. That's it. I don't know what the time was, but hopefully. So there's maybe a question or two, but we'll get to that after.
I think we're going to do questions later, but Steve, before you put that down, one of the beautiful things about having a real meeting in a real place is the odd conversations that happen. So Steve was talking to the fellow who actually manages this building before the talk. And one of Steve's slides was all the photovoltaics on the roof here. Over to you to explain that.
Yeah, so Gord was telling me that the PV system on the roof here during COVID, because they haven't been able to have events in the hall, and so there's no revenue from the events, the PV has basically paid the overhead of operating this facility for the last year and 3 quarters. It generates enough cash flow that it's just made the place survive in the last, whatever that is now, 22 months. So that's cool.
Yeah, that's great. Okay, thank you. I also wanted to acknowledge the Electric Vehicle Society is in the room. David Kunke is chair of that organization. And also Ralph Torrey has just joined us. He was one of the speakers last week. So we're really happy to have you here, Ralph. Okay, next up is Judy Smith.
Okay. I'm going to talk tonight about what municipalities in Northumberland are up to and going forward and what they've done to date. So I'll just wait for the presentation. Okay, so combating climate change. Why do we need to act? That's the first step. Next slide, please. Because we're already implementing the carbon future our children will inherit, impacting the future level of greenhouse gas emissions is not a choice. It's already implicit in everything we do. The real choice is whether we exercise the power and influence we have while we still can. In the next few minutes, I will tell you about some of the measures taking place in Northumberland to mitigate global warming and to provide some resiliency to defend ourselves from the extreme weather events which are currently happening in Canada and which will happen here. Not if, but when. I'll start off by saying planning for climate change impacts in the county and by the 7-member municipalities for severe heat waves, flooding, tornadoes, ice storms, and wildfires is not in place, nor has climate change entered the picture. Next slide. Climate scientists say we have 10 years to flatten the curve to prevent serious runaway climate change. We're currently at a global increase of 1.1 degrees Celsius. Looking around at the devastation in BC and on the East Coast, can you imagine what a 3 or 4 degree rise will bring? Here is an example of how extreme things will get. The Canadian Climate Atlas shows what summers in Northumberland will look like. In the 20th century, we had 2 to 3 days when the temperature rose above 30 degrees Celsius in the summer. Now we have 13, and by mid-century, it'll climb to 37 days. By the end of the century, 70 days will be above 30 degrees Celsius, which is 86 degrees Fahrenheit. This will be coupled with warm nights, creating heat waves. This is just one of the problems we'll be facing going forward. And we are the last generation that can do anything about it. New slide. So I've used the term a running start because we don't have time for incremental change at this point. We have to make transformational changes. But the first step is to protect our vulnerable populations. First, we have to provide resilient housing that protects residents from extreme weather events and power outages. We have to establish a neighborhood level program to check on vulnerable people during times of emergency. And some of this has already started to happen in Cobourg. Nicole Beatty was applying it in terms of the pandemic, but it will also apply with climate change. We'll also have to set a maximum temperature bylaw, not just a minimum, to protect from heat waves. Next slide, please. So a running start on housing. Cobourg has approval to investigate the financial feasibility of net zero mass retrofits of low-income neighborhoods on behalf of the Federation of Canadian Municipalities. Doing deep retrofits a neighborhood at a time, starting with low-income neighborhoods first, ties in with the county and municipal efforts to improve affordable housing. 31% of residents in Cobourg spend more than 30% on fuel and electricity, putting them in energy poverty. And that applies pretty generally across Northumberland. Figuring out how to support a low interest, long-term community retrofit program with financing from several possible sources will be the first step in the FCM pilot process Cobourg will endeavor to do. What we learn will inform other communities across Canada. Another step that Cobourg is taking is they're establishing a green development standard for new residential buildings that'll be a template for other municipalities in Northumberland. It'll require that all new buildings be carbon-free by 2035 and be energy efficient to passive house standards, which is 90% better than regular standards. This could be a stepped program, beginning with a 25% improvement and 4 years later, a net zero ready target, and then finally by 2035 or sooner, net zero similar to what Whitby, Ontario is already set up and has in place. Whitby has also included environmental improvements along with each of their steps, incorporating community gardens, parks, trees, bike sharing, car sharing, EV charging, complete neighborhoods. Cobourg's impending sustainability plan being drafted next year can cover off some of these environmental elements too. Meanwhile, Lakefront Utility Services is providing solar services to commercial and institutional organizations to help decarbonize. Next slide, please. Because vehicles and buildings are the biggest source of greenhouse gas emissions in Cobourg and in all the other municipalities in Northumberland, except for Port Hope, where residential is third and manufacturing is second, the efforts to curb our use of fossil fuels is focused on these sources. By 2035, gas furnaces and gasoline or diesel vehicles will not be sold in Canada. Next slide. So, a running start on vehicles. Passenger vehicles, fleets, transit, and ambulances will have to be electric. Off-road and heavy equipment will have to be electric or biofueled or hydrogen fueled. We're moving slowly on this front in Northumberland. Most local municipalities were going to install 33 electric vehicle chargers in public spaces, but in the end, only 4 are being installed in Port Hope. The rest, with government grant support, were snapped up by other municipalities because the municipalities in Cobourg, which were offered them, didn't take it up. The county is planning to have some electric pickup vehicles, perhaps 4 in place by 2030. Not too ambitious, but a beginning. One bright light in Northumberland is that we have a very active electric vehicle society advocating with local commercial and residential developers and car dealerships, and even the Cobourg Police Force, which are looking to adopt electric vehicles in their next purchase cycle. Next slide, please. Running start on Microtransit. Small, more efficient bus transit. Cobourg's already adopted it, and they hope to align with Port Hope as well. Hamilton Township could be another possibility if the Climate Change Advisory Committee of that township recommends it to their council. Shuttle-sized hybrid or electric vehicles doing door-to-door on-demand service with no fixed routes and providing accessible transit to handicapped and able-bodied residents alike provides an equality of service and I think will increase the likelihood people will take transit. Right now, it's $2 a ride, and you can try it yourself right now. And hopefully next year we'll be getting the new vehicles to go along with it. Cobourg, as you can tell, is the most advanced of the municipalities in Northumberland on climate change mitigation. After declaring a climate emergency, the council is meeting the microtransit recommendation and 2 of the building recommendations key to the Climate Action Plan vision to reach net zero by 2050, which was passed in principle in November of 2019. These projects, along with a wider sustainability plan, will begin in earnest next year. There will be public engagement in which I hope you all participate. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Judy. And I just want to tell everyone that Judy, as the first environmental officer for the county, was hired in April 2019, and she has been the engine behind almost all of this work for the last 2 years. So thank you very much, Judy.
You.
And now Craig.
Debatable whether I need a mic. My wife. Okay, a lexicon group. We're not the biggest, but we think we're the best. I don't order my Starbucks in 5 minutes, so this is going to be a challenge. So a lexicon group for, stand on the X, is the non-regulated affiliate of Lexicon Corporation. Our cousin or sister company is the utility. So the utility is the poles and wires that deliver electricity to a couple 100,000 homes and businesses in their service territory. We are the unregulated part of the business. We're like, if we were in a band, they would be the tuba, we would be the electric guitar. So we're allowed to go after all sorts of unregulated markets, and our main business focus is helping businesses and organizations and municipalities reduce their energy consumption, reduce their utility consumption, and improve sustainability. And we have contracts all across Canada where we do that, and plenty in Ontario. And then another major part of our business is helping provide electric vehicle charging infrastructure to, again, all sorts of organizations. A big push right now is in multi-unit residential building applications, but there will be more electric vehicle chargers installed next year in Canada than all previous years combined. It is going like this. And some of you, I'm sure, can see that happening out in the market. And it's not just because of government incentives. Everybody is asking for it. They're doing it on their own. So that's exciting. Next slide. So I wanted to talk a little bit more macro about distributed energy resources. That's something you may have heard of and maybe don't fully understand. This is the opposite of distributed energy resources. So that's what, this is a giant coal plant. We're very lucky, as Steve said, in Ontario to have mostly very clean renewable energy as our main source for electricity between nuclear and hydro. But many parts of the world and many parts of the US still rely heavily on gas and coal to deliver electricity. But this is centralized energy, and that's what everybody's probably been used to most of their lives. And then we go to the next slide. Distributed energy resources are, following really the exact opposite. It means it does not require centralized economies of scale. If you're going to build a nuclear power plant, generally speaking, you need billions of dollars. The power has to be distributed over hundreds and thousands, if not millions of residents. And they're very difficult long-term capital projects. Distributed energy are things that can be done on a much smaller scale and don't have nearly the same sort of economies of scale requirements. So solar works, yes, it's better to have 3 megawatts of solar than 3 kilowatts, but there isn't a huge difference in the cost per unit of a 3 kilowatt plant versus a 3 megawatt plant. There isn't major economies of scale in solar. And many of these things can be deployed on a much smaller scale, and they can be deployed by private businesses, they can be deployed by municipalities. And so example is geothermal. We're part of a large geothermal district energy plant in Brooklyn, in Whitby area, that's going to supply a whole new development there. We've done many and continue to do solar plus storage projects. That is starting to compete directly with the grid. And so in that case, it may not be offsetting use of natural gas, but it can be reducing the cost of electricity, which can provide savings that can be used to offset natural gas in other areas. So it's not always just about offsetting natural gas. It could be reducing the cost of electricity so that you can afford to offset natural gas. So electrification, generally speaking, for those who don't know, natural gas is generally cheaper than electricity on a per kilowatt hour basis. So you have to find solutions that keeps the client whole. So we work on the front lines of climate change in the real world. So our solutions have to work in the real world for clients, and they are all concerned about sustainability, but they're also concerned about cost. So it's finding that balance. This is in the bottom left here, this is a biogas cogeneration plant that's using methane from sewage in the Belleville wastewater treatment plant, converting it to natural gas. We use that to create electricity and heat, which all goes right back into the plant processes. So that's a poop closed loop. If you're, and it works extremely well. And it's using all of that rather than flaming off or burning off all of that methane. We're using it that energy in a renewable way. So that's going to be a big thing at wastewater treatment plants. And then, as Steve was alluding to, electric vehicles are also a distributed energy resource. They are batteries on wheels, large batteries on wheels. Eventually, the grid will be able to draw from those. You'll be able to draw from those from your house as a backup power source, and they'll be sort of create this mesh network of battery power. So we're not there yet, but that's the evolution of what's happening with electric vehicles. Next slide. So a great example, Burnbrae you've probably all had a Burnbrae egg at one time or another, or you probably did and you didn't know it. The biggest egg producer in Canada by far. And Burnbrae is very passionate about sustainability and the environment. This is a facility we did, which is first of its kind in North America, a completely off-grid modern egg farm facility. Now this, when I say completely off-grid, it is connected to the grid, but it operates over 90% off-grid off of solar and storage. And again, this is something that people aren't realizing how far the technology and cost has come. That is competing against Hydro One head to head. That was 3 years ago. There is probably there's very few farms in Ontario that can't be converted to mostly solar and compete with electric. So, and reduce the cost. So this is something that people don't see happening behind the scenes, but we're moving from where FIT and microfit and these subsidized programs dominated solar to where we went flat for a long time because those programs weren't available. Now we're going to see a whole second wave based on pure economics, and it's really exciting. Last slide. The most important distributed energy resource is you, and people don't realize that. You have, whether it's a business owner or an individual, as Steve was alluding to, and Judy's alluded to in parts of her talk, this is where most real things happen. I'm in municipal buildings constantly as part of my role in helping clients. The vast majority of them are doing 5% of what they could to reduce greenhouse gases. And they may have a poster, but I can tell you, I'm not casting aspersions on any of them. They're doing almost nothing to reduce greenhouse gases. If any of you go to an indoor pool here? Okay. Do you know if it has a cover on it at night? I can guarantee you if it's in Canada, it doesn't. Okay. Can you imagine having a giant Olympic-sized pool that oftentimes from 8 p.m. to 8 a.m. the next day isn't covered? So it's literally doubling the amount of natural gas used at that site and the number of GHGs. And so these are simple examples I'm giving you. The vast majority of facilities, municipal facilities, don't have programmable thermostats. And you're going to say, I don't believe that. Well, I'll give you a list. It's very unusual to see a programmable thermostat in a municipal building. So many municipal buildings we go to, I wouldn't say most, I'd say at least half, don't have LED lights. So this is the tip of the iceberg, but I'm pointing out that distributed energy resources includes demand. Demand in the system is where all the energy is used. So almost every single client we work with can reduce their energy consumption and greenhouse gas emissions by 30%, like falling out of a boat. And so that's where I encourage people to think about in their daily lives and in their businesses how to make these improvements. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Craig, and thanks to all of you. There's so much food for thought here, and the questions are already coming in from our online audience. But I'm going to start us off here with a question for Steve about travel offsets. What is your opinion on travel offsets, and is there such a thing as climate-friendly travel?
Oh, that's a very murky area to wade into. It's evolving, I guess is one way I would say, and we're talking about air travel specifically, I think, because it's the one most people are sort of conscious of. There's no question that, per kilometer, your emissions when you're traveling by air are quite high, and we tend to go long distances, so that the tons add up fairly quickly on these transatlantic flights. I don't know, most people here probably don't know an Airbus carries like 150,000 liters of fuel, and most of that gets burned. They keep a little spare just in case. But the offset business is really tricky right now. There's about 8 international standards that are recognized, and I think they have very good intentions in terms of trying to make the offsets meaningful. The problem with a lot of the offsets is we don't really know how long they're going to last. So if you plant trees in a place where there may not have been trees, and those trees grow and they sequester carbon, that's great. And maybe that carbon does eventually, from your flight, those tons of carbon do get absorbed into that wood. But how long is it in that wood? What happens to that forest? Does it burn down? Does someone cut it? How do we secure it against the future release of that carbon? And a lot of the projects, we really don't have the assurance that that's going to happen. So offsets, I received some legitimate criticism from that front. My personal feeling about the travel thing is that if you want to feel like you're doing something meaningful, look at your total carbon footprint, and there's online calculators, and afterwards I can certainly chat with you because it's fairly easy to develop it for people, and decide where you want to try to make a difference. And certainly vehicles, how you heat your home, how much you travel. Maybe it isn't not traveling, but it's how much you travel certainly makes a big difference. They talk about, a large airplane, a small airplane, how many stops there are in the flight. That can make some difference in the sort of maybe 10 to 20% emission level difference. But I think the real thing to push for is airplanes that don't use fossil fuels. So we're going to go to biofuels, or we're going to go to hydrogen. Hydrogen-powered airplanes probably won't be through the engineering and development for at least 10 to 15 years. Biofuel planes are already being flown, and you can choose at various airlines to have a percentage of your fuel be biofuel. So that's one way to go, but the percentages are fairly low. So, buy offsets. I think there's nothing wrong with buying offsets, so you're not doing any harm with offsets, but whether they're going to get us out of the pickle of flying, I think not. And I guess the thought experiment I would do around offsets is we tend to compartmentalize that to flying, but why not buy it for our home heating? Why not buy it if we're still driving a gasoline car? Why not buy it for our food? We compartmentalize it. And I think you need to look at your life and your footprint holistically and try to make decisions throughout all of the big impacts that reduce emissions, if that's a personal goal for you. That's my first thought.
Thank you very much. That's a long thought. Next question is for Judy. Can you tell us about the work of the sustainability and climate emergency committees, advisory committees in Cobourg and elsewhere that you've been part of?
Yes, the Cobourg has had an environmental advisory committee for 10 to 15, maybe even 20 years. Port Hope has had a working group on climate change, and they've recently set up new conditions for an environmental committee, advisory committee to council. The problem is there's a lot of ennui in Port Hope. There's a disincentive to be engaged with their advisory committees, and a boycott mentality, which I think in the time of a climate emergency isn't the best way forward. And Port Hope has a lot of issues to deal with, one being and this isn't directly, well, it's related to climate change in that about 50,000 trees will come down as they clean up the arsenic that it was deposited at the same time as the high level or low level radioactive wastes in the community. In order to capture it all, they have to eliminate 50,000 trees. So where is the heat island effect? How are we going to protect Port Hope from heat waves with that significant loss of trees? Now, they're very concerned about Penryn Woods, which is under 2,000 trees. But I wish there was more attention to this bigger problem. And so if you are part of an organization that can appeal to the Nuclear Regulatory Safety Board to say you would like to see the standards for asbestos raised to 100 parts per million from 8 parts per million in the soil, which also is a safe level according to scientific experts. That may help change things, because right now the Port Hope Area Initiative has to follow this guideline of 8 parts per million. And recently, Hamilton Township formed an environmental advisory committee. So that's 3. Brighton, against the advice of their staff, also has formed an environmental advisory committee. And I hear Cremmy is considering doing the same. we're still, there's still no advisory committee on the environment, a citizens committee in Trent Hills or Alnwick, Haldeman, or Crammy. And as soon as they're all formed, then you've got some basis for working together on a lot of these issues. And but we're fortunate in this area, especially Cobourg, because it has sustainable Cobourg. There's Blue Dot Northumberland. There's the Electric Vehicle Society, and there's the Land Trust, and I'm missing another group. Who am I forgetting?
Community Power Northumberland.
Community Power Northumberland. And so all of those groups are have helped get a climate declaration, emergency declaration in Cobourg, and they have worked hard to try to see this issue given enough attention.
Thank you very much, Judy. I think you meant to say arsenic, not asbestos.
Oh, did I say
in the parts family?
asbestos?
Yeah.
Sorry.
That's okay. It was just a little slip.
Thank you.
I'm now taking a question from our online audience. Is it number 2? Okay. And this will be for Craig. Does switching to battery vehicles and other carbon reducing technologies just shift the problems in environmentalism to something else? Like, how do we responsibly dispose of and mine lithium batteries?
I'm glad you asked me that. Yeah, no, it's a good question. I've seen quite a bit of discourse on this topic, that, you know, mining lithium and, you know, whatever social and economic costs and benefits of that versus the status quo. I would say that the pervading view amongst us in the electric vehicle crowd, and I've been there since 2015, would say that you know the benefits of switching from carbon, which is the what is creating problems in the climate, to electric vehicles. I don't think there's any scientific question at all at this point, certainly not mainstream, that it's even close in terms of you know, comparing the two, meaning the ecosystem of mining lithium or other forms of, and by the way, we haven't even scratched the surface of the kinds of materials we'll use for batteries in the future. We're still very early in the development of batteries, so that's going to get better. So is the recycling of lithium batteries. So there's certainly a lot of work to be done, but my answer would be that it's not close in terms of comparing burning fossil fuels as the primary way, you know, method of powering transportation versus battery vehicles, even though certainly there are downsides. You could say, well, look at, you know, there's child labor being used in, you know, the Sudan for mining lithium, and those are real issues. But I think I think that will improve, but I think they pale in comparison to the you know, the carbon economy and the oil and gas. So I think it's not something we should ignore, but I would say it's not. I think it's a false equivalency to suggest. I'm not suggesting that the questioner is saying this, but I think when you see those kind of articles, it's an absolute false equivalency. It's not like, oh, it's one's 49 and one's 51. You know, one's 3 and one's 98 or 90, you know, 97. So I think that's what the science says about that issue. But again, it's not trivial. I mean, there isn't a really great way to recycle lithium today. It's still evolving, and lithium batteries. And certainly there's the same issues. Any mining period is going to have issues, especially in developing countries, around the socioeconomic, you know, factors that go into that mining. It's not unique to lithium though. Anything we take out of the ground, there's a cost to it.
Okay, thank you very much. I invite anyone in the room who has a question to go to the mic over there, if you're interested. Otherwise, we have more coming in from online. One is directed at Steve. This is another electric vehicle kind of question. A lot of proposals to lower our carbon footprint involve high upfront costs, like buying an EV. What are some lower cost options for people who may not be able to afford these suggestions?
So first, I would use the example of looking at the life cycle cost of owning a vehicle. And yes, in the case of EVs, it's mostly people buying new or just slightly used vehicles. And yes, they're costing more than a 15-year-old small car. But if you look right now at the cost of buying a new EV at the lower end, and I'm not talking about the $80,000 EVs, which are wonderful machines, but for most people, there are EVs now that with the current federal rebate actually are in the $40,000 plus or minus a couple $1,000s that have a range of 400 kilometers. In fact, right now, the only reason you can't buy them in Canada is because they're sold out. So the market is quite hungry. The average cost of a new car in Canada right now is just over $40,000. So that's before tax. So the current crop of 400 kilometer basic EVs, which are actually very luxurious cars compared to the cheapest cars, are, to me, it's actually a bargain in terms of the car you get. And then you look at the savings. And for most people that have not owned a hybrid car, if you've had a regular gas-powered car, the EV is going to immediately save you about $2,000 a year in gas. And if you've had a four-wheel drive SUV, it's probably going to save you $3,000 a year in gas at today's prices. The EVs also have generally no scheduled maintenance. Craig and I were just talking before because we both had EVs for about 7 or 8 years. And in the 7 years of ownership of 2 different EVs for me, I went to the dealership once because there were no other needs to go there. There's no scheduled maintenance. So if you look at the life cycle costs, generally they're coming out as cheap on a 5 or 10 year basis as the cheapest car you can buy. And so I think we need to look at that. And that's probably going to get even better. And I'm even suspicious that there's a bit of a premium on some of these cars because of the rebates. And if the rebates disappeared, we might even see MSRP prices drop by a couple $1,000. To answer the question though, for people that can't afford a $40,000 car, don't have the cash, don't have the line of credit, whatever, there is a growing used EV car market. And used EVs are going to generally be quite good cars to own because they're turning out to be about half the cost of owning over in terms of maintenance, they're turning out to be about half the cost of ownership of gas-powered cars. So once there is a crop of used EVs and there are already some, I sold my 8-year-old used EV for $8,000, which I was happy to get. And the people that bought it were happy to get it, and they're not having to buy gas anymore. And they got a $1,000 credit from the used car incentive program, which is run out of Plug and Drive, which is a sort of quasi-private organization, I guess. Yeah. It's a privately funded incentive anyway right now, $1,000 on a used car. So it will get better for people that don't have the capital for a $40,000 car as the used car market starts to have eventually, of course, thousands of used EVs.
Thank you very much. Here's another question from our Zoom world. What up and coming sustainable technologies are the panelists most excited about? Who would like to take that?
Start.
Okay.
I think with the switch from gas furnaces to heat pumps, we're going to see a major change there. And they'll be smaller, they'll combine air exchange, it'll be heating and cooling, and it will also heat your water, your household water, all at a 300% efficiency improvement. So we're all going to need cooling in our houses going forward, and heat pump technology is sufficient for our climate. They go down to minus 25 C, and if it's cooler than that, which happens very infrequently and will be less frequent in the future, a little radiative heater turns on. So you're never going to be out of heating, but the cooling combined with it and well-insulated buildings are going to be very important going forward.
Thanks. We've got about 8 minutes left, and we have someone in the audience who wants to ask a question, so please go ahead.
I guess following along about the building and heating, is there any kind of, I guess, force behind the idea that with Cobourg looking forward to a lot of development, a lot of new housing, of enforcing some really strict rules about how those houses are built? I mean, you still see ridiculously large houses with windows that don't have double glazing. They have no eyebrow to, they're not built with any kind of recognition of the weather, just the assumption that you blast air conditioning or heat at them. Is there an appetite for Cobourg and the area to really take a step forward and say to the developers, no, this is what we want?
Thanks. Great question.
Development standards that I mentioned are the strict environmental approach. That's going to be developed next year, and I'm hoping it'll be close to the Whitby model, so that these houses are going to be high performance efficient buildings with heat pumps, decarbonized. There won't be any gas, anything in them. And in order to be efficient, they won't have double glazed windows or single glazed windows. I didn't think they even did that. I think most windows are double glazed now, but they will be triple glazed, and they will save maintenance costs on the householder, just like electric vehicles save for drivers, the maintenance and operation costs. So we're on the cusp of that. And as I said, gas furnaces are going to be, you won't be able to buy one in 14 years from now. So change is going to happen quickly.
And I will just add that I did a development story for Watershed magazine in the fall. I interviewed a lot of planners and developers, and I asked them, is there an appetite for heat pumps? You know, are people demanding it? And they said no. So they're waiting for people to come forward and request these lower carbon options.
I was going to say I totally agree with what you said about heat pumps, especially air source heat pumps. And they are now starting to be demanded in the private sector and the commercial market. So that is absolutely going to be a major push in the next 5 to 10 years, is because air source heat pumps have gotten way better than they were just 5 years ago, and that doesn't always get a lot of press. So totally agree on that. Some of the less stuff that doesn't get the press, but I can tell you behind the scenes, again, on being on the front lines and working in, with clients every day. So we're working with several different technologies that improve the heat transfer capabilities of water and glycol. And you might all say, who cares about that? Well, the reason that's important is that so many systems that work in our world, in the energy world, and in chillers and in heating, rely on transferring heat from one form to another, typically through the use of liquid from one place to another. And by improving the ability of that liquid to absorb heat and transfer heat, you can dramatically improve the efficiency of a lot of these systems. So we have 2 different technologies we're working with now that are actively being used by municipalities, by private customers. One is a nanotechnology. It's an additive that we add to glycol. Does that mean my time's up?
No, I don't know what that means.
Okay, if it keeps ticking, run. And that additive is improving the efficiency of those HVAC systems by almost 30%, which is unheard of for an additive to glycol. Another one we're doing is we're removing, we're de-aerating ice that's being used to, or water that's being used to resurface ice in arenas. So a lot of people probably don't know one of the single biggest greenhouse gas emitters in Canada is the resurfacing of ice rinks. So to resurface ice rinks uses scalding 145-degree water, 200 gallons at a time. So just think about that. That is like 40, 45-minute teenage showers for those of you who have teenagers. And that's a lot of hot water, and that's a lot of natural gas. And so we're converting all those systems to cold water. Think about, the cold, wash your clothes with cold water, same concept. So we're able to remove that air and those bubbles with a different technology. It's making a dramatic, in fact, there may not be one single technology that does more in natural gas reduction in any sort of practical sense over the next 5 years than that one technology. So, and obviously really relevant for Canada because we like to resurface ice every, 45 minutes. So there's a couple of examples, but those are real technologies that, again, don't get all the press, but there's for every two of the two I mentioned, there's another 25 behind it, constant development. So it's very exciting.
Thanks, Craig. There had to be hockey in this somewhere.
Yeah, absolutely.
We now have a question about agriculture, and we have been given the green light to go a little bit longer, so I'm happy for that. What is being done in Northumberland to mitigate carbon emissions from agriculture?
Well,
Judy?
we did start before the pandemic and held a meeting at the county of a number of the agencies that work provincially, federally, and the Ontario Federation of Agriculture and some other organizations to look at what we could do locally. There is a movement here to try to move off of cash cropping back to pasture. And if you set up a business of grass-fed beef, starting with the poorer pieces of your property which aren't doing that well under cash cropping, because there's a lot of hilly landscape in Northumberland County, that it would provide income better than current farmers are getting, because for the most part they're buying retail and selling wholesale. So their profit margin is dropping substantially. And the way they're dealing with that is to try to put more and more of their property, and a lot of the land isn't that good, into cash crops and for export. So if Northumberland became branded as a grass-fed beef place to come, like the county is branded for wine, it might offer a different possibility. The other thing is, if the land is flat and good, you shouldn't leave it barren in the winter, because we're losing carbon from the soil, which is draining it of its fertility. So we should be cover cropping. And there are programs to help farmers do that. And the Ontario Federation of Agriculture was interested in doing a bit more of that. Another thing is greenhouses in the Windsor-Sarnia area are flourishing there, but they can't provide enough electricity for them. And we could be importing more of that business up to Northumberland and having greenhouses that would provide us with material, vegetables, greens year round, which is also a good idea given the climate emergency, instead of getting our greens from California with all the problems that are out there. So more greenhouses, cover cropping, and switching to pasture are three of the areas that were just getting underway when the pandemic sort of shut things down a bit. But I do hope those ideas move forward.
Thanks, Judy. I see a farmer in the wings. Mark DeYoung.
Yes, I'm also the president of Northumberland Federation of Agriculture. I would just like to address the room as to what agriculture is really doing, because we farm over 3,000 acres of cash cropping, and we have livestock as well. We do cover crops, and we thankfully and gratefully appreciate the money that we do get from the government to help put those cover crops in, because they sequester more carbon than we get profit back from those cover crops. As far as pasturing goes, we pasture the hills that we cannot crop, absolutely. But to plant everything to grass would not be, I don't think would be an environmentally sustainable thing to do, because the crops we do grow, like legumes, also take the nitrogen out of the atmosphere. So the other situation I have with so many environmental groups here is 4% of the land in Ontario is croppable. We lose 175 acres a day to development. Where is our food going to come from? So we didn't want to talk about food, but I do.
Thank you, Mark. I think development pressure could be another series for NLC. Here's a question for Steve. Where can someone find resources to look into rebates and initiatives to help in purchasing an EV?
Probably in Ontario, the best place to go is Plug and Drive. They're located near Richmond Hill, but these days you can just go online, just Google Plug N Drive. It's run by Kara Clareman, and they have staff, and they have a good website with all the EVs that are available. They have the incentive information, and they are also the administrators of the used EV incentive. The federal rebate is done through the dealer you'd buy your car from. And the used EV rebate also has $1,000 if you actually send your gasoline car, if it's worn out enough, to the scrap heap. You'll actually get an additional $1,000 in used EV. So Plug and Drive is a great place. There's a few. They do, yes, thank you, Doug. They also have a whole bunch of electric vehicles there, and you can book a test drive, and you can do that during COVID as well. They have a protocol for that, so you can drive a whole bunch of different EVs. There's no sales pressure. They're actually supported financially a bit by OPG, but also through private financing. So they're not a sales office, and they won't put any sales pressure on you. You just drive the EV, enjoy it. So I would highly recommend Plug and Drive as a place to go to actually experience an EV. As well, the EV Society of Northumberland. David Kungi and Doug are here from the society, and I'm part of it as well. And we're having a number of events, some online and in local high schools recently. So you can certainly just Google EV Society of Northumberland, and one of us would be happy to respond and send you, hopefully to a website that might help if you have a specific question.
Thanks, Steve. That's great. We heard a lot in the last lecture last week about the importance of government acting now, the urgency of government acting now. And so I would like to ask the panel, what do you think needs to happen next at the provincial level for starters, and then the federal level? Anyone want to take that?
I'm happy to dive in on that. I think one of the things we're lacking in Ontario is actually a plan. We don't have a plan for reducing greenhouse gases that's sort of officially sanctioned and driven by our provincial government. We don't have a concrete set of actions for 2030, and we certainly don't have anything for beyond 2030. And I've met with the Minister of Environment in the last few months with Blue Dot Northumberland, and we have specifically said to Minister Piccini that we need a plan. Where that'll go, we don't know. We're hoping to hear back before Christmas about some kind of plan, but I think that's critical. And I know, for people like Craig in business, they need a level playing field. The money is there, the will is there, the interest is there, the technology is there, but you have to create a level playing field with a long enough window of opportunity for business to gear up and do what they're capable of doing. And you only have that when you have a long-term plan. It can't be a 3-year plan, a 5-year plan. It's not enough for the kind of financing that we need to electrify, our province over the next 30 years, fully electrify virtually everything. So a plan would be really great. Good start.
Any other thoughts, Judy or Craig?
Yeah, I agree with everything Steve said. You may have seen a lot of announcements. You've seen them on LinkedIn certainly, but maybe you've seen them through other venues where Doug Ford is, extolling the virtues of, hey, we're going to be the biggest electric vehicle. We're going to be huge and #1 in North America, and I think that's great. I do think that's great to be a part of that. But to me, it's ironic. What gets almost basically zero attention is charging electric vehicles, and as you said, at even a provincial level, certainly not at a federal level. It's a very blunt instrument. It's not done very well, and even the car manufacturers are not doing a good job outside of Tesla of providing the charging network that people want. We were talking before about, hey, what's the next electric vehicle you would buy, and and I was thinking, well, geez, maybe I would buy a VW or an Audi, but the reality is I couldn't buy one now. Even if I could get one, I have nowhere to charge it away from my home from a practical standpoint. I can't drive to Cobourg with an Audi today, which is ridiculous when you think about it, but that's just the reality. So I'd love to see the provincial government and the federal government spend as much time worrying about where, being the leader in the world in terms of vehicle charging and supercharging as manufacturing, because the charging part's more important and it's far more under their control than manufacturing, which can be very, as I'm sure everybody's seen here, it's great when they love you and the manufacturers love you, but then when they want to pull out, they pull out. That's just the reality. So, so that's one area. I think the other area is, to your point, a plan and putting us on a level playing field, because we have to appreciate that we're in competition. So New York, Massachusetts, Pennsylvania, New Jersey all have some substantial subsidies for clean energy, for solar, for battery storage. We effectively have zero in any kind of coordinated fashion. Agricultural actually has some, but and so what ends up happening is all of our, it's a brain drain. We're competing against companies in New York. Well, who's going to be better at solar and storage than it's going to be the companies that actually have business to do, and our Canadian companies here have to do, focus on New York and Massachusetts. So I think that's a shame, given, I think where we are is Canada wanting to sort of lead in the green revolution. So I think there's a number of areas, but yeah, unfortunately, it's become political, and green and sustainability shouldn't be political. It should be, we have to find a way to find that happy medium to say it's good for business and good for the world, and it is possible, those two things. Mm-hmm. So it's a shame we've kind of picked one or the other.
Final thoughts, Judy?
Well, I also would say it'd be great if the province started to put in the mandate of Ontario Hydro and Ontario Power Generation and the independent IESO, Independent Electric Systems Operator, yeah. The requirement that climate change be part of their mandate, because right now it's just least cost. So now that we've taken coal out of the electricity system, they're putting natural gas back in. So our carbon emissions from electricity are going up. And I just find that the programs Hydro One has or OPG has are pitiful compared to the natural gas programs of Enbridge. And I think they could be much more vigorous and robust, and I don't know if that's because the government isn't pushing it forward, and we need to have a government that will take climate change seriously and energy efficiency and seriously.
Okay, thank you very much. I wanted to say that we had been in touch with Minister Piccini, and he sent his regrets about not being able to come tonight, but we're certainly going to deliver these messages to him. He has offered us a time to meet on December 21st in the morning, so we will get a group of people together and strategize about that. So that's it for now. thank you very much, everyone in the room, everyone online, and for submitting your questions. I also wanted to thank NLC for organizing this series. It was a bold thing to do, and I'm really glad they did it, especially around COP26. If you're in the room and want to speak further to the panelists or other groups, we have Blue Dot Northumberland, Sustainable Cobourg, Port Hope for the Future, about tree removal in Port Hope due to arsenic, the EV Society, Community Power Northumberland, and the National Farmers Association. What is the name? Northumberland Federation of Agriculture. Thank you very much. Okay, I'm going to pass it back to Betty now. Thank you.
Thanks, Denny. Wow, what an instructive and eye-opening hour and 15 minutes, sorry. And thank you for indulging us. We have our work cut out for us, but because of tonight, I think we know a lot more about what we can do as individuals, as a community, as a country. Let's hope. Thank you to the panel. And thank you, Denny, for moderating it. And thank you to those at home who sent in such terrific questions. Just to let you know what's happening with NLC, we're going to take a break in programming over the next few months while we plan for 2022. But we will be back in February to present distinguished human rights lawyer and activist Irwin Kotler. And in April, we'll have a program on Alberta and including, no doubt, a discussion on the decarbonization of Canada and a potential showdown between the federal and provincial governments on that issue. So look forward to that. We do, and I hope you will join us. And until then, thank you so much for your support. Good night.